Welcome to another journey through history, one that gently invites you to drift into a world long past. Tonight, we will explore the life inside the Ottoman Empire, a realm that spans centuries and connected continents, blending the ancient and the modern, the East and the West. But, as with many periods in history, beneath the grandeur and power, there were also struggles, hardships, and untold stories. Imagine yourself standing at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, where diverse cultures, languages, and faiths converged, all under the rule of the Ottomans. The empire's expanse was vast, stretching from the bustling markets of Istanbul to the sun-drenched deserts of Arabia. Life within its borders was complex, often challenging, and shaped by both luxury and suffering. You will hear about the daily lives of its citizens, the struggles of the lower classes, and the secrets hidden within its walls. Let the rhythmic cadence of history wash over you as we journey into the Ottoman past. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and imagine stepping into a world where the scent of spices fills the air, the sounds of the marketplace hum softly in the background, and the weight of centuries-old traditions presses down on every part of life. This is where we begin. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, was a vast and powerful entity. Its borders stretched across much of Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa, connecting disparate worlds. But while this empire was known for its glory and power, it was also a place where daily life for many was difficult, often marked by routine struggles, complex societal structures, and harsh realities. Imagine yourself waking up in the morning, the cool air of dawn settling over the bustling city of Constantinople, or Istanbul, as it was later called. The sounds of the city greet you, the distant toll of the mosque's call to prayer, the clatter of market stalls being set up, and the cries of vendors offering goods from distant lands. As you stretch, you might feel the weight of your position in this complex society pressing upon you. For the common people of the empire, life was one of survival. The majority of the population lived as peasants or tradespeople, their lives governed by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of their work. Farmers labored in the fields, tending crops of wheat, barley, and cotton, while artisans toiled away in workshops, crafting everything from fine carpets to pottery. Life in the city was not much easier. The narrow, winding streets of Istanbul were filled with the constant movement of people, merchants haggling, women in colorful veils moving with purpose, and children playing in the streets. But beneath this bustle, there were constant struggles for survival. Food was often scarce. The grain trade, essential for feeding the empire's vast population, was tightly controlled. Long hours were spent laboring just to put food on the table. Imagine yourself as a simple tradesperson, perhaps a weaver or a blacksmith, working from dawn until dusk. The air around you is thick with the smell of sweat, the sound of the loom or hammer striking metal. There's little room for rest, but you push on, your livelihood depends on it. And then, of course, there's the weather. Harsh winters in the north, and scorching summers in the south make survival a constant struggle for many. Cities like Constantinople, with its dense population, were vulnerable to disease outbreaks, often sweeping through neighborhoods with little warning. The squalid conditions in poor areas, with narrow alleyways and cramped houses, made it all the more likely that disease would spread quickly. The crowded marketplaces and public baths, where people gathered to wash and socialize, were often a breeding ground for illness. But not everyone lived this way. The empire was also home to a small elite class, who lived in luxury and comfort compared to the common folk. As we'll explore later, these privileged few enjoyed the finest foods, beautiful homes, and a life of relative ease. Their day-to-day struggles were far different, focused more on managing power, wealth, and influence than on basic survival. For the lower classes, though, life was defined by hardship, routine, and a constant effort to maintain one's position within the social hierarchy. Imagine yourself in the shoes of a common person, perhaps a merchant or a farmer, dealing with the pressures of work, family, and survival in an empire where stability was often fleeting. You would be living in the shadow of grandiose palaces and beautiful mosques, but your life would be a far cry from the wealth and power that defined the empire's ruling class. And yet, there were moments of joy. Festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations brought temporary respite to those who could attend. The colors, the music, the food, all brought a brief reprieve from the daily grind. The Ottoman Empire was, after all, a land of contrasts, of struggle and triumph, of poverty and luxury, of rigid hierarchy and the fleeting joys of life. As we leave this first exploration of daily life behind, we prepare to delve deeper into one of the most remarkable figures in Ottoman history. Now, imagine yourself stepping into the grandeur of the 16th century, into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, under the reign of one of its most iconic rulers, Suleiman the Magnificent. Picture the lush gardens of his palace, the delicate sound of fountains trickling, and the ceremonial grandeur of his court, as if the very air vibrates with the power of his empire. Yet behind this magnificence was a man of immense ambition, intelligence, and complexity, someone whose rule would shape not just the Ottoman Empire but the entire world. Suleiman ascended to the throne in 1520, at the age of 26, inheriting an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the Persian Gulf in the east, and from the Sahara Desert in the south to the steppes of Central Asia in the north. It was a vast domain, one that required a ruler of extraordinary vision and capability. And Suleiman proved to be just that. From the outset, Suleiman's reign was marked by significant military and territorial expansion. His campaigns were far-reaching, pushing Ottoman borders deeper into Europe, Africa, and Asia. Imagine yourself as one of his soldiers, the weight of your armor heavy as you march through foreign lands. The air is thick with anticipation and the sounds of marching feet. The heat of the battlefield presses on you, and the constant tension of potential conflict is always in the air. Suleiman was a strategic genius, and his military campaigns were meticulously planned, every move designed to ensure the growth and strength of his empire. Under his command, the Ottomans defeated the Hungarians at the Battle of Mohacs, and his forces seized the island of Rhodes, further cementing his dominance in the Mediterranean. But it wasn't just on the battlefield where Suleiman made his mark. His reign was also a period of cultural renaissance for the Ottoman Empire. Imagine yourself within the walls of his palace, surrounded by exquisite works of art, architecture, and poetry. Suleiman was a patron of the arts, commissioning beautiful mosques, palaces, and bridges that would come to define the empire. His court became a center of intellectual and cultural exchange, where scholars, poets, and artists flourished. Suleiman himself was not just a conqueror, but a poet and a lawgiver. His reforms in the legal system, known as the canon, brought about much-needed stability and order to the empire, ensuring a more consistent application of laws. As the years passed, Suleiman's reign reached its zenith, but with power came challenges. His later years were marked by internal strife within his own family, particularly the tragic story of his son, Mustafa. Suleiman's love for his children was immense, yet the political realities of the time meant that his family's ambitions were fraught with danger. Mustafa, who was once seen as the heir apparent, was ultimately executed, a tragic event that cast a shadow over the latter part of Suleiman's reign. The whispers of betrayal, the weight of fatherly duty, and the grim demands of succession, these were the burdens of an emperor. Imagine the isolation Suleiman must have felt, sitting alone in his grand palace, the weight of the empire on his shoulders, and the betrayal of his sons still haunting him. He was a ruler who had everything: territory, wealth, influence. But he also paid a heavy personal price. As the years went on, the empire that he had worked so hard to expand began to slow. Suleiman's later years were spent overseeing an empire that, despite its glory, was facing internal decay, economic difficulties, and mounting pressure from European rivals. His death in 1566 marked the end of an era for the Ottomans. The empire, though still powerful, began its slow decline after his passing. His son, Selim II, who took the throne, was not able to maintain the same level of control and vision. Suleiman's reign, once a symbol of Ottoman greatness, would eventually give way to a slower, gradual erosion of power. Yet, Suleiman's legacy endured. He was remembered not only as a conqueror but also as a reformer, a poet, and a man who sought to leave behind a more just and beautiful empire. As we move forward, we will leave the life of Suleiman behind and delve into one of the darker aspects of Ottoman society, the hidden world of Ottoman slavery. From the grand palaces to the fields of the empire, slavery played an integral, though often unseen, role in Ottoman life. What did it mean to live as a slave under the Ottomans? Now, as we shift from the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire's high court to the shadows that lie beneath its surface, we must acknowledge the dark reality of its social fabric, slavery. It was a pervasive institution that, while often concealed from the eyes of the elite, played a critical role in the functioning of the empire. As you imagine the streets of Constantinople, its markets, its palaces, its vibrant, bustling squares, it's easy to forget the silent presence of those who worked without freedom. In the homes, on the farms, and within the imperial palace, slaves made up a significant portion of the population, their lives defined by their subjugation. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was not the same as the chattel slavery seen in other parts of the world, but it was no less significant or harsh. It was a system that operated on both visible and hidden levels, with slaves employed in various sectors, from domestic service to military training. As you imagine walking through a grand palace, behind the shimmering golden gates and elaborate courtyards, there is a different world within its walls, the world of the harem, where women lived in seclusion, bound by the whims of the Sultan and his court. These women, many of whom were slaves or captives, were often taken from distant lands, sold into service, and though they lived in luxury, their lives were defined by confinement and obedience. Imagine the experience of a young girl, perhaps from the Caucasus or Eastern Europe, forcibly taken from her home and transported to the heart of the Ottoman Empire. She would have arrived in a strange, unfamiliar world, with the thick scent of incense in the air, the clinking of ornate metalwork around her, and the cold stone floors beneath her feet. It was a life of isolation, of beauty mixed with cruelty, as she entered a world where her every move was controlled by those who owned her. Despite the luxurious surroundings of the harem, these women had little freedom. Their primary role was to serve, and their lives were spent in the shadows, away from the public eye. Outside the harem, slavery took on a different form, though the lives of these slaves were equally grueling. In the fields, on the docks, and in the kitchens, slaves toiled under the harshest of conditions, often working from sunrise until nightfall. Many of these slaves were captured during Ottoman military campaigns, taken from conquered lands and sold into the empire's markets. The life of a field slave, working the fertile lands of Anatolia or Egypt, was grueling. Imagine the blistering heat of the day, the sweat trickling down your back as you plow the earth, the scent of crops mixing with the dust in the air. For those who worked in the imperial palace, their lives, while less physically demanding, were no less stifling. They were constantly at the mercy of their masters, their futures uncertain. The Ottoman Empire was also unique in its system of using slaves within its military. The elite janissaries, the empire's most feared soldiers, were often made up of Christian boys who were taken through the Dersham system, a practice where boys from Christian families in the Balkans were recruited, converted to Islam, and trained as soldiers. While these boys were given status and power in the army, they were still slaves in the eyes of the empire. They lived in barracks, subject to harsh training and rigid discipline. Their lives were far from easy, with long hours of training, constant warfare, and the ever-present expectation of loyalty to the Sultan. The Janissaries were powerful, but their power came with a cost. Freedom was not theirs. Slavery in the Ottoman Empire was also deeply tied to the empire's religious and legal system. Under Islamic law, slavery was permitted, but there were strict guidelines about the treatment of slaves. Slaves were expected to be treated humanely, but in practice, this was not always the case. Many slaves in the empire were treated as little more than property, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters. And while some slaves rose to positions of influence, most lived out their lives in servitude, their names lost to history. Imagine yourself, then, standing at the edge of this world, where power and privilege coexist with suffering and subjugation. The empire, which prided itself on its strength and wealth, was built in part on the labor and lives of those it enslaved. Yet, much like the luxurious palaces that towered over the empire's vast cities, the system of slavery was hidden behind a veil of opulence. Beneath the surface, the reality for many was one of silence, confinement, and labor. As we leave the hidden world of Ottoman slavery, we move forward into the next segment, where we will turn our attention to the military life of the Ottoman soldiers. We will explore the disciplined, relentless training that made the Ottomans such a formidable force on the battlefield. The Janissaries were just one part of this complex military machine, but their story offers insight into the constant battle and sacrifice required of those who served the empire. Now we move from the hidden lives of slaves and commoners to the more visible, yet equally demanding world of the Ottoman military. Picture yourself in the midst of a grand encampment, the sun still low on the horizon as the first rays of light cast long shadows across the dusty ground. The steady sound of men preparing for another day of training fills the air, their movements synchronized, disciplined. This is the life of an Ottoman soldier, a life defined by constant readiness, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the empire. The Ottoman military, once the beating heart of the empire's success, was a highly structured and rigid institution. From the far-reaching provinces of the empire to the imperial capital itself, the demand for soldiers was unrelenting. Every able-bodied male was required to serve, and the military became a fixture in the daily lives of many Ottoman citizens. The call to arms was a responsibility not easily avoided. Imagine yourself as a young recruit, standing in the courtyard of a military barracks. The air smells of leather and sweat, the sounds of drills and the sharp commands of officers ringing through the space. You are part of a regiment, perhaps one of the famed Janissaries, the elite infantry that was at the core of Ottoman military power. These soldiers were often conscripted through the Devshirme system, taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained rigorously from a young age. For them, the military was not just a career, it was a life. The Janissaries, often considered among the best trained soldiers in the world, were subjected to grueling routines. Their days began early, long before the sun had fully risen, and continued into the evening with drills, combat training, and exercises designed to perfect their physical and mental endurance. Imagine yourself moving through the motions of sword fighting, your body aching from hours of practice. The sweat drips from your brow as you focus on each strike, each movement, striving for perfection. The sound of the clashing swords, the command to move, to regroup, it's a rhythm, a relentless cycle that continues day after day. The Janissaries were not just soldiers. They were also a political force, often wielding significant power within the empire. They were loyal to the Sultan, but their loyalty was not without its demands. They were deeply integrated into the political machinery of the empire, sometimes even playing a role in the sultan's succession. Their influence was undeniable, and as their power grew, so did their expectations. The life of a janissary was one of both privilege and sacrifice, a life of constant preparation, constant readiness, and a deep bond to the military institution. For those soldiers who were not part of the janissary corps, the life was equally demanding, though not as glamorous. The majority of Ottoman soldiers were part of the Sipahi, the cavalry that made up the backbone of the empire's military forces. Imagine the heavy armor, the clinking of chains and shields as you mount your horse, the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the earth as you ride into battle. The Sipahi were responsible for maintaining order in the provinces, patrolling the borders, and engaging in military campaigns. Their lives were constantly on the move, their days filled with the long hours of training, of riding, and of preparing for battle. But for all soldiers, whether janissary or Sipahi, the life of an Ottoman soldier was filled with hardship. The empire's vast territories required soldiers to be prepared for long campaigns that could last months or even years. The soldiers would march for miles across barren deserts, through thick forests, or along the rugged coasts, enduring harsh weather, scarcity of food, and the ever-present threat of enemy forces. Their supply lines were often stretched thin, and food, water, and other resources were always in limited supply. The soldiers faced constant exhaustion, their bodies worn down by the weight of their armor, their feet sore from endless marches, their stomachs empty more often than full. Imagine the feeling of hunger gnawing at you, the dry taste of dust in your mouth as you march, the weight of your armor pressing down on your shoulders. The wind carries with it the scent of the battlefield, blood, sweat, and the acrid tang of gunpowder. There is no time for rest, no room for weakness. Every soldier knew that the survival of the empire depended on their perseverance, their strength, and their ability to endure the constant strain of military life. The Ottoman Empire was constantly at war. From the conquest of new territories to the defense of its borders, the empire's military was always in motion, never resting. The Sultan's army fought in numerous campaigns, both within the empire's borders and beyond, as the Ottomans sought to expand their influence. Whether it was the campaigns against the Safavids in Persia, the battles with the Habsburgs in Central Europe, or the long-standing war with the Venetians, the Ottoman military was stretched across vast distances, constantly engaged in a dance of strategy and conflict. In these campaigns, the toll on soldiers was great. Even if they returned victorious, they often found that the hardships of war left them changed, physically scarred, mentally exhausted, and spiritually drained. The victories, though celebrated, came at a cost. And for those who perished on the battlefield, their lives were often marked only by the silent mourning of comrades and the brief mention in the annals of the empire's history. The toll of war also extended to the empire's citizens. As soldiers were sent off to battle, families were left behind to carry on with their lives, waiting for news, wondering if they would ever see their loved ones again. The sound of the drum that called soldiers to arms echoed in every corner of the empire, a constant reminder of the empire's reliance on its military might. But it was a reminder that came with a deep sense of foreboding, the fear of war, the dread of losing everything in the chaos of battle. As you reflect on the life of the Ottoman soldier, you realize that it was not just a life of military duty, but a life of sacrifice. Each soldier, whether in the elite Janissary Corps or the weary Sipahi, gave everything for the empire. Their lives were shaped by the constant threat of death, the endless demand for service, and the struggle to protect the vast, sprawling empire that depended on their courage and strength. Imagine yourself, now, as the battle fades from your mind, the sounds of the battlefield slowly ebbing away into the distance. The life of the Ottoman soldier, relentless and demanding, fades into the quiet hum of the past, leaving behind only the echoes of their footsteps on the path to empire. Now, imagine stepping through the high gates of the Topkapi Palace, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The palace, with its majestic walls, intricate tiles, and sprawling courtyards, feels like a world unto itself. But beyond the grand halls and royal chambers, there is a world of its own, hidden behind the lush gardens, veiled in secrecy, and defined by power and isolation. This is the harem, the place where the women of the Sultan's court lived, women who, though surrounded by luxury, faced lives shaped by confinement, intrigue, and manipulation. Picture the quiet murmur of women's voices as you move through the intricate, maze-like corridors of the harem. The air smells of rosewater, incense, and the faint scent of the jasmine that climbs up the palace walls. The soft rustle of silk and the muted sounds of feet gliding over marble floors fill the air. Here, you are surrounded by women who hold great influence over the Sultan, yet their lives are largely dictated by the whims of others. Life in the harem was complex, layered with power dynamics, emotions, and political games. To the outside world, the harem was often perceived as a place of opulence, a symbol of the Sultan's wealth and power. The women who resided here were, after all, among the most privileged in the empire. They wore luxurious silks, adorned themselves with the finest jewelry, and were surrounded by beauty. Beautiful rooms filled with rugs and cushions, gardens filled with exotic flowers, and fountains whose water softly splashed in the serene courtyards. Yet beneath this veil of opulence lay a different truth. Life in the harem was a world defined by control and hierarchy. The women, though pampered in many ways, were rarely free. Their movements were restricted, their roles tightly defined. They were not allowed to leave the palace grounds, and their time was often spent in silence, secluded from the outside world. Even within the harem, they were assigned specific roles, with some women elevated to higher status than others, while others were relegated to more mundane tasks. Imagine the life of a woman who enters the harem at a young age, perhaps one of the many slaves captured from distant lands, brought to the palace to serve. The very first day she steps into the harem, she would be awed by the luxurious surroundings, the delicate fragrances of spices and perfumes in the air, the soft lighting that bathes the rooms in a warm glow. But for her, this new life is one of submission. She is a member of a rigid, hierarchical system that measures worth based on beauty, favor, and proximity to the Sultan. Some women would eventually rise in the harem's social order. Those who caught the Sultan's eye might become concubines, elevated to positions of power, sometimes even becoming wives. The Sultan himself, though married to a woman of high rank, would often take multiple concubines, and it was in these relationships that much of the empire's political influence was concentrated. The women of the harem wielded significant influence, but it was influence acquired not through their own actions, but through their connection to the Sultan. Imagine one of these women, now a concubine, living in an ornate chamber. Her room is lavishly decorated, filled with velvet cushions and ornate carpets. But despite the beauty that surrounds her, her life is defined by the Sultan's attentions, or lack thereof. Each woman in the harem was in competition with the others, vying for the Sultan's favor. The pressure to maintain one's beauty, to remain in the Sultan's favor, was constant. One misstep, one loss of favor, and a woman could fall from grace, losing her position in the harem and potentially her place in the palace altogether. The women in the harem were not just defined by their relationship to the Sultan. Their lives were often shaped by the competition between each other. Rivalries were common, with women striving for power, influence, and prestige. Imagine the jealousy that might arise between concubines, the whispered conversations behind closed doors as they plot, connive, and scheme. The atmosphere within the harem was one of constant tension, but also of great beauty, woven with the threads of luxury, love, and power. But even for those women who gained favor, the harem was often a place of deep isolation. For all the luxury they enjoyed, they were still prisoners within its walls. The palace guards, who ensured no one left, kept a watchful eye on them. Their only interactions with the outside world were those permitted by the Sultan or his officials. For many women, their lives were confined to the palace, with little contact beyond it. The harem could be a place of love, but it was also a place of solitude, where women were often unable to form relationships outside the palace. The isolation could be stifling, and the rigid structure of their existence left little room for personal freedom. The Sultan's harem was not just a physical space, it was an emotional and political entity. Women of the harem wielded influence in subtle, sometimes hidden, ways. They could advocate for the interests of their family, influence political decisions, and even secure positions of power within the empire. In many cases, a woman's son, born in the harem, might one day become the Sultan himself, ensuring the legacy of her family and her own place in history. But despite their power, the women of the harem were always bound by the Sultan's whims. The court's intrigue, the politics of favor, and the pressure to maintain beauty and favor could make the harem a place of both opulence and frustration. The women who lived here were symbols of the empire's wealth and excess, yet their lives were not their own. As you reflect on the world of the harem, you realize the deep complexities of their lives. While the women of the Sultan's court were cloaked in luxury, they were also cloaked in isolation. Their world, though beautiful, was a gilded cage, one where the pursuit of power, beauty, and favor shaped their existence. They lived in the shadows of the Sultan's grandeur, their stories intertwined with his legacy, but always at the mercy of the empire's most powerful figure. And as you leave the harem behind, the whispered voices and the scent of rosewater begin to fade, leaving you with the quiet knowledge of the complex, hidden lives that shaped the Ottoman Empire from within the palace walls. As we move from the world of the harem, a world of power and isolation, we now turn to the warriors who served the Ottoman Empire with unwavering discipline and dedication. The Janissaries, the elite infantry of the empire, were not only the most feared soldiers of their time, but they also symbolized the might of the Sultan's reign. Their lives, however, were defined by a strict, often brutal training regime and an unyielding loyalty to the empire. Imagine yourself standing in the barracks of the Janissary Corps, the thick scent of leather and sweat hanging in the air. The sound of marching feet fills the space, echoing off the stone walls. The Janissaries, each one a product of years of rigorous training, move in perfect unison, their every action an expression of discipline and devotion. Their armor clinks softly as they practice their drills, their swords slicing through the air with precision. This is a life not just of service, but of constant preparation for battle. The Janissaries were not born into their roles. They were recruited through the devshirm system, a practice that saw Christian boys from the empire's provinces taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the Sultan. These young recruits, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, would be raised and indoctrinated into the military life. Their childhoods were shaped by an education in combat, discipline, and loyalty, a loyalty that would be tested again and again on the battlefield. Picture yourself as one of these young recruits. You were taken from your home, far from the vast city of Constantinople, and brought to the imperial capital. The transition from the familiar world of your village to the disciplined, controlled environment of the Janissary Corps is jarring. You are surrounded by strangers, forced to leave behind everything you know. Yet, as the days pass, the harsh training begins to shape you into something different, a soldier, devoted to the Sultan and the Empire. The daily routine is grueling. Each day begins before the first light of dawn, with the sound of a bell marking the start of your training. Your instructors, known as Aga, are stern and demanding, pushing you to the limits of your endurance. Your body aches from hours of physical conditioning, running, jumping, practicing with weapons, and engaging in mock battles. You are taught not just how to fight, but how to think like a soldier, how to operate within the strict hierarchy of the Ottoman military system. The training is relentless. You are expected to master the use of the kilage, a curved sword, as well as the bow, the iconic weapon of the Janissaries. Each motion must be practiced until it is second nature, swift, precise, and efficient. Imagine the weight of the sword in your hand as you swing it in perfect synchronization with your fellow soldiers. The sound of the blades slicing through the air becomes familiar, almost comforting, as you train for hours on end. There is little time for rest, as each moment of downtime is spent preparing for the next lesson, the next drill, the next challenge. As you progress through your training, you become part of something larger than yourself. The Janissaries were not just soldiers, they were a brotherhood, bound together by their shared experiences and unwavering loyalty to the Sultan. This bond, forged through years of rigorous training, would carry them into battle and beyond. But it was not just the physical demands of their training that shaped them. It was also the psychological toll. The Janissaries were taught to be loyal to the Sultan above all else. They were given a unique position within the empire, neither bound by traditional nobility nor constrained by social class. As elite soldiers, they were granted privileges, including regular pay and access to the finest equipment. They lived apart from the rest of Ottoman society, separate from the everyday struggles of peasants and artisans. They were a distinct group, respected and feared in equal measure. But this privilege came with a cost. The loyalty of the Janissaries was absolute, and their devotion to the Sultan was their defining characteristic. This loyalty often meant that they could not form personal attachments or pursue ambitions outside the military. Their lives were dedicated entirely to service, to the empire, and to the protection of the Sultan. They had little room for personal choice, their futures intertwined with the fate of the empire itself. The Janissaries were often at the forefront of the empire's military campaigns, from the conquests of the Balkans to the sieges of Vienna. As elite soldiers, they led the charge in some of the empire's most important battles. Imagine yourself standing on the battlefield, the air thick with tension, the sound of drums signaling the beginning of combat. The Janissaries would charge forward, their swords raised high, their faces determined. The battlefield was a place where their training came to life, where every motion, every strategy, was put to the test. But the Janissaries were not just warriors. They were also an integral part of the empire's political structure. Over time, they gained considerable influence, often participating in the Sultan's court, and even playing a role in the selection of rulers. Their power within the empire grew, and with it, their sense of entitlement. By the 17th century, the Janissaries began to exert their influence outside the battlefield, becoming a political force in their own right. However, as the Janissaries' power grew, so too did the challenges they faced. The Ottoman Empire, once at the height of its military might, began to decline. The Janissaries, who had been the empire's backbone, found themselves struggling against the changing world. Their once unwavering loyalty to the Sultan began to waver as they became more entrenched in their own political interests. The discipline that had defined them began to erode, and their once unified fronts started to fracture. Imagine, then, the slow decay of the once mighty Janissary Corps. The soldiers who had once marched with pride now found themselves out of step with the empire they had served. The demands of modern warfare, the changing political landscape, and the growing corruption within their ranks all contributed to the downfall of the Janissaries. In 1826, the Janissary Corps was finally dissolved by Sultan Mahmud II, marking the end of an era. The once proud warriors, whose loyalty had shaped the Ottoman Empire for centuries, were no longer needed. As you reflect on the life of the Janissaries, you realize that theirs was a life of relentless discipline, sacrifice, and loyalty. They were warriors in the truest sense, trained from childhood to serve, to fight, and to protect the empire. Yet, in the end, the very qualities that had once made them so powerful also led to their downfall. Their legacy remains a testament to the complexities of loyalty, the price of power, and the slow erosion of an empire once defined by its might. As we leave behind the world of the elite soldiers, we now turn our attention to the grand structures that defined the Ottoman Empire, a legacy of towering domes, intricate mosaics, and elegant courtyards. Ottoman architecture is renowned for its beauty, its scale, and its profound influence on the cities and landscapes of the empire. But behind the stunning facades and grandiose interiors, there lies a story of labor, hardship, and sacrifice, a story that reflects both the splendor and the burden of empire building. Imagine yourself standing before the great mosque of Sultan Ahmed, commonly known as the Blue Mosque, in the heart of Constantinople. The sight is awe-inspiring. The massive domes rise high above, surrounded by graceful minarets that reach toward the sky. The intricate tiles cover the walls, their patterns an elegant dance of blues and golds. The vast courtyard is alive with the gentle sounds of worshippers, the soft murmur of prayer, and the quiet call of the muezzin. Yet, behind this architectural marvel, there is another story, one of immense labor and meticulous craftsmanship. The men who built this mosque, and the other grand structures of the empire, worked tirelessly, their lives marked by long hours, grueling conditions, and often dangerous labor. Imagine being one of the countless workers who toiled under the supervision of the master builders. Perhaps you are a stonemason, your hands rough and calloused from years of chiseling stone. The scent of dust and stone fills the air as you work tirelessly to carve the delicate patterns that will adorn the mosque's walls. The work is slow, meticulous, and requires the utmost precision. Every line you carve, every surface you smooth, must be perfect. The weight of expectation is immense, for these buildings will stand for centuries, bearing witness to the power and grandeur of the Ottoman Empire. The construction of these grand buildings required not only skill but also an army of laborers. Skilled artisans, masons, carpenters, and laborers would be gathered from across the empire, often working under harsh conditions. The Ottoman Empire, with its vast territories, had access to a wide pool of labor, and many workers were recruited from rural areas, where they were brought into the cities to work on these monumental projects. Imagine yourself, a farmer or artisan from a far-flung province, suddenly thrust into the urban hustle of Istanbul. You are tasked with laboring on a grand mosque, your days spent lifting heavy stones, carrying materials, or weaving intricate carpets. The work itself was grueling. The long days stretched into weeks, months, and even years. The air in the workshops and construction sites was thick with dust, and the heat of summer made the work even more difficult. The workers had little time for rest, their every movement dictated by the needs of the project. The sounds of hammering, chiseling, and shouting echoed across the construction site, as the empire's builders worked in sync to create something that would stand as a symbol of Ottoman power. But the work was not without its dangers. Imagine, if you will, the precarious scaffolding that climbed higher and higher with each passing day. The men who worked on these towering structures were exposed to the elements, the weight of heavy materials, and the constant threat of injury. A slip, a misstep, could mean a fall from a great height, and the risk of death or injury was ever present. Yet, despite the dangers, the workers continued, driven by the promise of work, the prestige of participating in such an important endeavor, or the need to provide for their families. As you imagine the workers laboring on these monumental structures, you begin to appreciate the sheer scale of the tasks they undertook. Every mosque, every palace, every fortress was not just a building but a testament to the empire's wealth, ambition, and the backbreaking work of those who made it possible. Beyond the physical labor, there was also the intellectual challenge involved in Ottoman architecture. The architects, often trained in the imperial schools or brought from across the empire, had to balance the grandeur of the design with the practicalities of construction. The challenge of creating vast, open spaces beneath massive domes, without the support of modern engineering techniques, required great ingenuity. The famous architect Mimar Sinan, who oversaw the design of many of the most iconic Ottoman buildings, was not only a master builder but also an artist. Imagine him standing at the edge of a construction site, surveying the work of his laborers as they carefully place the stones that will support a grand dome. Sinan's masterpieces, like the Süleymanî Mosque in Istanbul, are known for their architectural harmony, their intricate beauty, and their use of light. But to achieve these marvels, Sinan and his team of builders relied on the labor and expertise of countless men and women. The final result, the towering dome, the majestic minarets, the intricate decorations, was the product of years of planning, endless labor, and unyielding dedication. The completion of these buildings was cause for great celebration. The grand structures, like the Blue Mosque or the Topkapi Palace, were symbols of Ottoman power and prestige. Yet, the celebration of these accomplishments often came after years of hardship for the workers who built them. For the laborers, there was no public recognition of their struggle, no grand ceremony in their honor. Their work was a silent contribution to the empire's glory, their names often forgotten, their faces lost in the shadows of history. And yet, the buildings they left behind continued to stand, silent witnesses to the labor that brought them into being. The mosques, palaces, and bridges built by the Ottomans are not just architectural marvels. They are monuments to the people who built them, whose sweat, toil, and sacrifice made the empire's grandeur possible. As you reflect on the Ottoman architecture, you are reminded of the hidden stories behind these grand structures, the lives of those who labored in the shadows, whose contributions are woven into the very fabric of the empire. The beauty of the buildings is undeniable, but it is the silent effort of countless workers that allowed them to endure, their stories engraved in every stone, every tile, every arch. As we step away from the grandeur of the empire's mosques and palaces, we now turn to the bustling arteries that kept the Ottoman Empire alive, its trade networks. Picture the vibrant marketplaces of Istanbul, the city where East and West met, where the scent of spices mingled with the salty air of the Bosphorus. The Ottoman Empire, strategically positioned at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa, was a hub of trade, its merchants connecting distant lands with the promise of goods and wealth. But behind this thriving commerce lies another side of the story, a story of labor, struggle, and the often harsh realities faced by the empire's merchants and common people. Imagine walking through the Grand Bazaar of Istanbul, a vast labyrinth of narrow alleys and arched doorways. The sounds of bargaining fill the air, merchants calling out prices, the clink of coins being exchanged, the soft rustle of silks and spices being inspected by eager buyers. The marketplace is a living entity, its pulse steady and relentless, as traders from across the empire and beyond come to sell their goods. The vibrant colors of textiles, the rich reds and golds of carpets, and the earthy tones of pottery all catch your eye. There is a hum of activity everywhere, and yet, beneath the surface of this marketplace of opulence, lies the story of the labor that makes it possible. Ottoman trade was both a boon and a burden for many of its citizens. For the empire's wealthiest merchants, trade was a means of prosperity and influence. These merchants controlled the flow of luxury goods, spices from India, silks from China, wool from England, and gold from Africa. Imagine yourself as one of these affluent merchants, making deals with traders from distant lands, your coffers filling with the wealth that flows through the empire's borders. Your life is one of privilege, comfort, and prestige. You live in a grand house, perhaps near the shores of the Bosphorus, and your reputation as a prosperous trader is known across the empire. But for the majority of the empire's citizens, life within the trading network was far less glamorous. Imagine yourself as one of the countless laborers who supported the empire's vast trade system. Perhaps you are a dock worker in Istanbul, unloading heavy crates of goods from ships that have arrived from across the seas. The salty air fills your lungs as you lift heavy sacks of grain, barrels of oil, or crates filled with textiles. Your hands are rough from the constant labor, your body aching from the weight of the cargo. The hours are long, and the work is physically demanding. Yet, despite the grueling nature of the job, you know that your labor is vital to the functioning of the empire's trade system. The ships that bring goods into the empire are a lifeline, but their arrival is fraught with difficulty. Imagine the sailors who navigate the unpredictable waters of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, and the Black Sea. Their lives are marked by the uncertainty of the sea, storms, pirates, and the constant threat of shipwrecks. The work is hard, dangerous, and often thankless, but it is the backbone of the empire's trade routes. The flow of goods into the empire and the export of Ottoman products to other parts of the world keeps the empire's economy alive, even as the lives of the sailors and traders who move these goods remain in the background. As the goods make their way through the bustling markets of Constantinople, they pass through the hands of countless workers, porters, craftsmen, and street vendors. Picture the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, the sound of a hammer striking metal, as blacksmiths forge tools that will be sold in the market. The steady rhythm of daily life in these neighborhoods is marked by the constant movement of goods, exotic spices, silks, ceramics, and textiles, every item carrying with it a story of distant lands and long journeys. But for the average worker, life is not easy. The goods that pass through their hands, whether they are textiles, spices, or ceramics, are not for them. The wealth generated by the empire's trade system is not shared equally. The merchant elite live in comfort, while those who labor to move, craft, and sell these goods often struggle to make ends meet. Imagine a laborer working the long hours of the day, earning little more than enough to survive. His small shop in the crowded streets of Istanbul is filled with wares from far-off lands, but the profits go not to him, but to the merchant who controls the trade routes. The disparity between the wealth of the merchant and the hardship of the laborer is evident in every transaction, every trade. Beyond the markets, the empire's trade networks reached far and wide, linking the Ottomans with Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Ottomans controlled key land and sea routes, including the famous Silk Road and the maritime routes through the Mediterranean. Imagine yourself as a trader in Cairo, bargaining with Venetian merchants over precious spices, or as a merchant in Baghdad, arranging the sale of fine silk to a merchant from Persia. These trade routes connected not just goods, but cultures, ideas, and technologies. The Ottoman Empire's strategic position allowed it to control the flow of goods between East and West, and it was this control that enabled the empire to thrive for centuries. However, the vast network of trade that brought wealth to the empire also brought challenges. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state, and managing the flow of goods between different groups was no easy task. Imagine the delicate balance required to ensure that trade routes remained open, that merchants and traders from various parts of the empire coexisted in relative peace. The empire's rulers had to maintain control over these diverse trade networks, ensuring that local disputes did not disrupt the smooth flow of goods. The complexity of managing these diverse peoples and their interests added another layer of difficulty to an already complex system. Trade was also a double-edged sword for the Ottomans. While the empire reaped immense wealth from its trade, the reliance on foreign goods and the control of key trade routes meant that the empire was vulnerable to external pressures. The arrival of European powers like the Portuguese and the Dutch, who sought to bypass Ottoman-controlled trade routes, began to erode the empire's dominance over global commerce. The increasing presence of European colonial powers further complicated the Ottoman Empire's economic situation, as it found itself struggling to maintain control over the lucrative markets it had once dominated. As you reflect on the vast trading empire that the Ottomans built, you realize that the wealth of the empire was not just about the goods that passed through its markets, but about the labor, sacrifice, and ingenuity of the people who made it all possible. For some, the empire's trade routes offered prosperity and luxury. For others, it was a daily struggle to survive within a system that often placed them at the bottom of the economic ladder. The ebb and flow of goods, spices, textiles, gold shaped the Ottoman world, but it was the people, laboring in the shadows, who made the empire's wealth possible. As you allow this image to fade into the background, you are left with the realization that trade, though vital, was also a system that could both uplift and exploit, a system that connected distant lands while often leaving the laborers' struggles unseen. As we step away from the bustling trade routes and the markets of Constantinople, we now enter a realm that permeated every aspect of life in the Ottoman Empire: religion. The Ottoman Empire was a vast, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious entity, but Islam, specifically Sunni Islam, was the central pillar upon which the empire's governance, society, and daily routines were built. Religion in the Ottoman world was not a private affair. It was woven into the very fabric of the empire, shaping everything from politics to personal identity. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Istanbul, where the call to prayer reverberates from the towering minarets of the grand mosques. The sound of the muezzin's voice carries on the breeze, a reminder of the empire's deep connection to Islam. The streets are alive with people, the merchants in their stalls, the laborers on their way to work, the scholars and imams walking to the mosques for their daily prayers. The rhythm of daily life in the Ottoman Empire was guided by the prayers, the fasting, and the teachings of Islam. Each day, as the sun rose and set, the empire's citizens were reminded of their spiritual duties, their responsibilities to Allah, and to the empire itself. Religion was not just a spiritual practice. It was a political tool, a way to maintain power and control across the vast expanse of the empire. The Sultan himself was not only the political ruler of the empire but also its religious leader. He was the Caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, and thus held both spiritual and temporal authority. Imagine the weight of this dual role. The Sultan was not only responsible for the military and administrative affairs of the empire but also for ensuring that the laws of Islam were upheld across the lands. The Sultan's decisions, therefore, had religious significance, and his legitimacy was tied to his adherence to Islamic principles. Picture yourself now in the court of the Sultan, surrounded by scholars and religious leaders who advise him on matters of both state and faith. The ulama, a class of religious scholars, wielded significant influence in the empire, helping to interpret and enforce Islamic law, or Sharia. These scholars were responsible for ensuring that the Sultan's rule aligned with Islamic teachings. The fatwas, or legal rulings issued by the ulama, guided everything from personal behavior to governance, shaping the legal and moral framework of Ottoman society. As you walk through the streets of the empire's cities, you see the profound influence of religion on daily life. The mosques, with their towering domes and graceful minarets, stand as symbols of Ottoman power and devotion. The scent of incense fills the air in these sacred spaces, as worshippers gather for their 5 daily prayers. The call to prayer echoes through the city, a rhythmic reminder of the central role that religion played in shaping not just the lives of the faithful, but the very structure of the empire itself. But Islam in the Ottoman Empire was not just about religious rituals. It was also about control. The Ottoman rulers, while generally tolerant of other faiths, enforced a strict adherence to Islam among their Muslim subjects. The empire's legal system, based in part on Islamic law, governed the lives of millions. The Sharia courts were responsible for resolving disputes, from family matters to criminal cases. In these courts, the influence of religion was clear, with judges ruling based on Islamic principles. Imagine yourself standing before a judge in one of these courts, where your fate could be decided not just by the law of the land, but by the teachings of the Quran. Yet, despite the empire's strong ties to Islam, the Ottoman world was far from homogeneous. The empire was home to numerous religious minorities, Christians, Jews, and others, whose lives were also shaped by the complex relationship between the state and religion. The millet system, a unique Ottoman institution, allowed for religious communities to govern themselves according to their own religious laws. Imagine the lives of these communities, who were allowed to practice their faith freely, yet still lived within the framework of the Ottoman Empire's control. The Christian and Jewish communities had their own leaders, their own religious courts, and their own schools. But they were also subject to the overarching authority of the Sultan, whose power as caliph extended over all subjects, regardless of their faith. For the Christian and Jewish populations, life under Ottoman rule was marked by a delicate balance. They were free to practice their religions, but they were also subject to the Sultan's laws and the jizya tax, a tax levied on non-Muslims. Imagine yourself as a member of one of these minority communities, navigating the delicate balance between maintaining your religious identity and fulfilling your obligations to the empire. The jizya tax was a reminder of the unequal status of non-Muslims, but it also provided a sense of protection, ensuring that the Sultan's rule would be respected, even by those outside the dominant Muslim community. Religious life in the Ottoman Empire was also deeply intertwined with the arts. The empire's mosques, schools, and palaces were not just places of worship and governance. They were centers of cultural and intellectual activity. Imagine yourself in the bustling courtyard of a madrasa, a school dedicated to the study of the Quran, law, and philosophy. The scent of freshly inked paper fills the air as students, both male and female, engage in heated discussions on Islamic jurisprudence, literature, and theology. The Ottomans prized education, particularly in the religious and philosophical traditions of Islam, and scholars were revered as the keepers of knowledge. Art and architecture, too, were deeply influenced by religion. The intricate calligraphy that adorned the walls of mosques and palaces, the geometric patterns and floral designs that covered the surfaces of the empire's most famous buildings. These were not just decorative elements. They were expressions of faith, representations of the divine order, and reminders of the presence of God in all aspects of life. Imagine yourself walking through the grand halls of the Topkapi Palace, where the walls are covered in ornate calligraphy, the words of the Quran elegantly woven into the architecture. Each curve, each line, each flourish of design is a reflection of the spiritual and artistic heritage of the Ottoman Empire. Religion in the Ottoman Empire was not just a personal matter, it was the thread that held together the fabric of society. From the Sultan's decisions in the court to the everyday lives of the people in the streets, Islam shaped every facet of life. But it was not a religion imposed by force. It was a system that allowed for personal faith to coexist with the demands of the empire. Religion in the Ottoman world was a tool of power, but it was also a source of unity, a way of binding the empire's diverse peoples together under a common banner. As you reflect on the profound impact of religion on the Ottoman Empire, you are reminded of the delicate balance between faith, power, and governance. The empire's religious foundations, while providing strength and cohesion, also created a structure of control that shaped the lives of millions. In this vast, multi-layered empire, religion was both a source of comfort and a mechanism of power, its influence reaching into every corner of Ottoman life. Now encounter one of its most painful and tragic chapters, an event that casts a long shadow over the empire's legacy. The Armenian genocide, which occurred during the final years of the Ottoman Empire, is a chapter in history marked by sorrow, loss, and the profound suffering of millions of people. It is a somber reminder of the destructive consequences of war, nationalism, and ethnic division. Imagine yourself in the heart of the empire in 1915, at the cusp of World War I. The Ottoman Empire, already crumbling under the pressures of war and internal dissent, is struggling to maintain control over its vast territories. The once great empire is now faced with multiple threats, both from external forces, like the Allied powers, and from within, as nationalist movements grow stronger. Among the various ethnic and religious groups in the empire, the Armenians, who had lived in the Ottoman Empire for centuries, were seen by some as a threat to the empire's stability. Tensions had been rising for years, fueled by a combination of political instability, ethnic divisions, and fears of separatism. The Armenian population, primarily concentrated in the eastern regions of the empire, had long faced discrimination and marginalization. The Armenians were an ancient Christian minority within a predominantly Muslim empire, and while they had historically been allowed to practice their faith, they were subject to numerous restrictions and prejudices. They were often seen as outsiders, and over time, they became scapegoats for the empire's growing struggles. Now, imagine the fear and uncertainty that gripped the Armenian community as the government of the Ottoman Empire, led by the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, began to take drastic action against them. In 1915, the Ottoman authorities initiated a campaign to remove the Armenians from their homes, deport them to the Syrian desert, and ultimately, to erase their presence from the empire altogether. What followed was a systematic attempt to annihilate an entire population, a campaign that would come to be known as the Armenian Genocide. The deportations began in the spring of 1915, when thousands of Armenians were rounded up, arrested, and forced to leave their homes. Imagine yourself among the Armenians who were taken from their villages, your belongings abandoned, your family members herded together in large groups. You are forced to march for miles, the hot sun beating down on you, the sound of soldiers' commands echoing in the distance. The roads are filled with the sick, the elderly, and the young, all walking in silence, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. The air is thick with the dust of the desert, and the cries of those who have fallen behind can be heard in the distance, fading away as the march continues. Along the way, the Armenian deportees were subjected to unspeakable suffering. Many died from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Others were subjected to violence, their lives brutally cut short by soldiers, bandits, and even their fellow travelers. Imagine the helplessness of those who could not keep up with the grueling pace, their bodies failing under the strain of the long journey. The desert, with its blistering heat and unforgiving landscape, became a place of death for countless Armenians, their bodies left to wither under the harsh sun. Those who survived the march were often sent to concentration camps or settlements in the Syrian desert, where conditions were no better. Imagine the desolation of these camps, where food was scarce, disease ran rampant, and the hope of survival seemed distant. The survivors of the genocide, those few who managed to escape the death marches, lived in constant fear, knowing that their survival came at the cost of so many others. The Armenian genocide was not just the result of the brutal deportations and massacres. It was also an attempt to erase the Armenian culture, identity, and heritage. Churches were destroyed, homes were looted, and entire communities were wiped off the map. Imagine the weight of loss that accompanied the destruction of centuries of history, the erasure of a people's presence in the land they had once called home. The cultural heritage of the Armenians, from their churches to their art and traditions, was systematically obliterated, leaving behind a void that would never fully be filled. The genocide did not end with the Ottoman Empire's collapse after World War I. The Turkish Republic, which emerged from the ruins of the empire, largely denied the events of 1915, and for many years, the genocide remained a silent chapter in Turkish history. For the Armenian people, however, the memory of the genocide was preserved through the survivors and their descendants, many of whom scattered across the globe, forming a diaspora that still carries the pain and memory of those lost. The Armenian genocide is a dark chapter not only in the history of the Ottoman Empire but in the history of humanity. It is a reminder of the capacity for cruelty that can arise from fear, nationalism, and the dehumanization of others. The scars of this atrocity remain, and the fight for recognition, for acknowledgement of the genocide continues to this day. But it is also a story of survival, of resilience, and of the unbroken spirit of the Armenian people, who, despite the efforts to erase them, continue to carry the memory of those who perished. As we reflect on the Armenian genocide, we are reminded of the devastating consequences of intolerance and the importance of bearing witness to history. It is a painful reminder that history is not just about the triumphs and the victories, but also about the deep scars left by violence and hatred. The stories of those who suffered during the genocide must be remembered, and their legacy must be honored, so that future generations may learn from the past and strive for a world where such horrors are never repeated. Now let's step into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where the grandeur of its rulers met the complexity of a diverse and bustling city. Constantinople, later known as Istanbul, was a city of profound contrasts, where luxury and poverty, east and west, ancient traditions and modern aspirations existed side by side. The city was a crossroads of cultures, religions, and peoples, and it was this unique blend that made it both the jewel of the Ottoman Empire and a place of constant tension and transformation. Imagine yourself in the heart of Constantinople, the imperial capital of the Ottoman world. The air is thick with the scent of spices from the markets, mingling with the salty breeze from the Bosphorus. The streets are alive with activity, merchants calling out their wares, children playing in the alleyways, and the rhythmic sound of horse-drawn carts echoing through the narrow streets. The city is vast, a maze of winding roads, ancient buildings, and sprawling courtyards, all surrounding the shimmering waters of the Bosphorus Strait. But the true character of Constantinople lies not in its architecture or its beauty, but in the way it has shaped the lives of those who call it home. This is a city where East meets West, where the ancient Byzantine Empire once ruled, and where the Ottomans brought their own influence, creating a tapestry of cultures, languages, and religions. In Constantinople, the lines between these worlds were not always clear, and the people who lived here were caught between these worlds, often navigating the complexities of daily life with a quiet resilience. Picture yourself as a resident of Constantinople, perhaps a merchant, a craftsman, or a laborer. The city, with its wealth and political importance, is a place of opportunities, but it is also a place of profound social stratification. The vast wealth of the elite stands in stark contrast to the squalor of the slums. In the grand palaces of the sultans and the mansions of the wealthy, the elite live lives of luxury, surrounded by the finest silks, the most exquisite carpets, and the most delicious foods. Yet, just a few streets away, the working poor struggle to survive, their lives marked by poverty and uncertainty. In the grand mosques and palaces, you would see the opulence of the ruling class, huge marble courtyards, intricate tile work, and golden minarets rising into the sky. The sounds of prayer fill the air as the faithful gather in the cool, shadowed spaces of the mosques. The scent of incense and roses is carried on the breeze, a reminder of the spiritual life that dominates the city. But outside these sacred spaces, the contrast is stark. The streets are often filled with the poor, who sell whatever they can, fruit, cloth, pottery, just to make enough to survive the day. The poor live in cramped, poorly constructed homes, their walls thin and crumbling, their lives a struggle to meet basic needs. For the merchants, Constantinople offers opportunities to engage in trade with the world beyond. The markets of the city are filled with goods from all corners of the empire: spices from India, silks from China, wool from Europe, and precious metals from Africa. The sounds of bargaining fill the air as traders from across the empire come to sell their goods. Yet even for these merchants, life is a daily challenge. The competition is fierce, the pressure to maintain a profitable business constant. Imagine yourself in one of these crowded markets, moving from stall to stall, negotiating prices, trying to make the best deal you can, all while the vibrant energy of the city surrounds you. The contrast between the elite and the common folk is not just about wealth, but also about culture. The elite live in a world of refinement, where poetry, philosophy, and music are integral parts of life. Imagine attending a banquet in the palace, where poets recite their verses and musicians play the delicate sounds of the oud and the ney. The conversation is sophisticated, the food rich and diverse, the company of the highest caliber. Yet, just outside these walls, life is often simpler, more difficult. The common people in the streets of Constantinople live without the luxuries of the palace, their entertainment coming from the bustling life of the city, from the lively markets and the street performances that bring the arts to the masses. Religion also plays a key role in defining the lives of those who call Constantinople home. As the city's spiritual heart, the mosques and religious institutions dominate the skyline. Imagine yourself as a devout Muslim, attending the morning prayer at the Suleymani Mosque, the call to prayer echoing across the city as you make your way to the mosque. The rhythm of the prayers, the stillness of the sacred space, offer a moment of peace and reflection in the midst of the bustling city. For those of other faiths, Constantinople is also home to Christian and Jewish communities, who live within the city but often in separate neighborhoods, practicing their faiths in parallel with the dominant Islamic culture. The millet system allowed for some degree of religious autonomy, with different communities governing themselves according to their own laws. Imagine the contrast of walking from the crowded, vibrant streets of the Muslim quarter to the quieter, more reserved areas of the Christian or Jewish communities. These neighborhoods are peaceful, often marked by the scent of incense from churches or synagogues, with the sound of hymns filling the air. The different faiths exist side by side, each contributing to the cultural and spiritual life of the city. Despite the tension and division, there is an undeniable sense of unity in Constantinople. This is a city of paradoxes, of wealth and poverty, of luxury and hardship, of division and unity. As you wander through the streets, you can feel the pulse of the city, a city that is constantly evolving, constantly balancing the old and the new, the spiritual and the material, the east and the west. The beauty of Constantinople is in its complexity. The city is not just a physical place, but a reflection of the empire itself, a place of contradictions, where different cultures and religions meet and influence one another. It is a city that has seen empires rise and fall, and yet it continues to stand, ever-changing, ever-evolving. The people who live in Constantinople navigate this world of contrasts, finding their place between the grand mosques and the crowded streets, between the opulence of the palace and the struggles of everyday life. As you reflect on life in Constantinople, you are reminded of the resilience of its people, of their ability to adapt, survive, and thrive in a city that was, and still is, one of the most vibrant and complex places in the world. As we move deeper into the complexities of life within the Ottoman Empire, we now turn our focus to education, an institution that shaped the future of the empire, but one that was also defined by its rigor and the heavy burdens it placed on its students. Education in the Ottoman Empire was both a privilege and a challenge, with paths that led to positions of power and influence, but often at great personal cost. The educational system was closely tied to the empire's needs and, like so many aspects of Ottoman society, was inextricably linked to religion, governance, and the future of the empire. Imagine yourself entering one of the empire's many madrasas, religious schools that served as centers of learning across the vast empire. The air is thick with the smell of old books and ink, and the sound of pens scratching across parchment fills the quiet room. The madrasa is a place of both intellectual and spiritual training, where students are not only taught to read and write, but are also immersed in the study of Islamic law, theology, philosophy, and mathematics. The walls of the madrasa are adorned with calligraphy, the verses of the Quran gracefully decorating the space. The sound of the muezzin's call to prayer can be heard faintly in the distance, a reminder of the religious foundations of this education. For the young men who entered the madrasa, education was a path to success, but it was also one that required immense dedication, discipline, and sacrifice. Picture yourself as one of these students, your days consumed by the study of religious texts, law, and science. The education system was rigorous, and the competition to excel was fierce. The curriculum was heavily focused on religious studies, with a particular emphasis on the Quran, Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Islamic jurisprudence. But beyond religion, students also learned geometry, astronomy, and medicine, subjects that would help them contribute to the empire's administration and military. The education process was not only academic but spiritual. You would be taught to view your studies as a form of worship, each lesson bringing you closer to understanding the will of Allah and contributing to the betterment of society. The goal was not just to acquire knowledge for personal gain, but to become a servant of the empire and its ruler, the Sultan. Imagine the weight of this responsibility as you study in silence, surrounded by fellow students who share the same sense of duty. The focus of your education is on service to the empire, whether as a scholar, a bureaucrat, or a military leader. But this path was not without its burdens. The intensity of the education system could be overwhelming. For many, the pressure to succeed was immense. The madrasa was often a strict, hierarchical institution, and the discipline required was unforgiving. There were few opportunities for relaxation or leisure. Every moment was dedicated to study. The days were long, the work demanding, and failure was not easily tolerated. Imagine the sense of isolation you might feel as you dedicate yourself entirely to your studies, cut off from the outside world. Your only focus is to excel, to prove your worth as a future leader of the empire. Beyond the madrasa, there was another route to education within the Ottoman imperial system, the palace schools, which were specifically designed to train the future bureaucrats, military officers, and administrators of the empire. Here, too, the pressure to succeed was immense, as these schools were designed to mold young men into powerful figures within the Ottoman administration. The curriculum was broader, focusing not only on religious education but also on languages, political science, and the management of the empire's vast territories. Imagine yourself as a student in one of these palace schools, where the stakes are even higher. The competition to gain favor and secure a position within the empire's administration is fierce, and your education becomes a matter of survival in a competitive and unforgiving environment. While these schools offered opportunities for upward mobility, they also carried a heavy emotional and psychological toll. The intense competition, the rigorous demands of the curriculum, and the constant pressure to perform could leave many students feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. The Ottoman educational system, though it provided access to power and influence, also left little room for personal freedom or exploration. The lives of many students were shaped not by their own desires or aspirations, but by the expectations of the empire. But despite these challenges, education in the Ottoman Empire was also a source of immense pride and achievement. For those who succeeded, the rewards were great. Graduates of the madrasas or palace schools often went on to serve in high-ranking positions within the empire's administration, military, or religious institutions. They were trusted with the responsibility of guiding the empire, enforcing the laws, and maintaining the order that held the empire together. These men were not just scholars. They were statesmen, soldiers, and religious leaders, whose decisions could shape the future of the empire. For the people of the Ottoman Empire, education was both a path to power and a burden that demanded sacrifice. It was a system that created a class of educated, highly skilled individuals, who were expected to serve the empire faithfully and diligently. But for many, the cost of this education was high: long years of study, rigid discipline, and a constant focus on duty, rather than personal ambition or freedom. The educational system also created a sense of continuity within the empire, a connection to the past that was deeply embedded in the Ottoman way of life. The knowledge passed down through generations of scholars, the teachings of the Quran, the study of law and science, formed the intellectual backbone of the empire. As you reflect on this, you realize that while the empire itself may have eventually crumbled, the legacy of Ottoman education, its emphasis on service, its commitment to learning, and its influence on the intellectual history of the region, remains a vital part of the empire's legacy. As you allow the memory of the madrasa, the palace schools, and the intellectual rigor of the Ottoman Empire to fade into the background, you are reminded of the complexity of this world. Education in the Ottoman Empire was not just about knowledge, it was about shaping the future of a vast and complex empire, and about ensuring that each individual played their part in the larger system of power and governance. As we move deeper into the fabric of Ottoman society, we now turn to the often overlooked but critically important role of women in the empire. The life of women in the Ottoman Empire was shaped by a complex mixture of social, religious, and political factors. While women had certain rights, their lives were also marked by restrictions, expectations, and the confines of a patriarchal system. Their roles varied depending on class, religion, and status, but for many, life was a balance of navigating the demands of the state, religion, and family. Imagine yourself as a woman living in the heart of Constantinople. The world around you is rich in culture, filled with the sounds of markets, the hum of daily life, and the distant call to prayer echoing across the city. But as a woman, your movements are restricted. You live within the private spaces of the home, your world largely confined to the courtyard or the family's residence. The walls of your home are your sanctuary, but they are also your prison. The city's vibrancy, its bustling markets, grand mosques, and lively streets, remains distant, and your access to the public sphere is limited. In the Ottoman Empire, the position of women was heavily influenced by Islam, and religious laws played a significant role in shaping the boundaries of their lives. Muslim women were expected to adhere to a strict code of modesty, which was reflected in the way they dressed, the way they interacted with men, and their presence in public spaces. Picture the women of the elite classes, cloaked in long, flowing garments, their heads covered with veils. In public, they would rarely show their faces to strangers, and their interactions with men outside the family were minimal. This modesty, dictated by the Islamic principles of the time, was meant to protect women from unwanted attention and preserve their dignity. The harem, the very word conjures images of intrigue, power, and secrecy, was both a place of luxury and confinement for many women in the Ottoman Empire. For women of the royal court, the harem was their world, where they lived under the watchful eyes of the Sultan and his officials. It was a place where power could be wielded, but it was also a place of intense isolation and competition. Imagine yourself as one of the women of the harem, surrounded by other women vying for the Sultan's favor. Your life is one of intricate rituals, where beauty, poise, and favor are everything. Yet, despite the luxury that surrounds you, silks, jewels, and lavish feasts, you are confined to the palace, your movements controlled, your world limited to the walls of this grand, but isolated space. But life in the harem, while marked by isolation and competition, was not without its privileges. Women who rose to the highest ranks within the harem could wield significant influence. The mother of the sultan, known as the Valide Sultan, often held immense political power, acting as a key advisor to her son and even having a say in matters of state. Imagine the power dynamics that unfold within the harem, as women navigate the intricate politics of favor and influence. Though their world was one of confinement, their impact on the empire could be profound. Outside the harem, women's roles were shaped by their social and economic status. For women of the lower classes, life was far less glamorous. Picture the daily struggles of a woman working in a bustling Ottoman marketplace, her days spent selling goods, bargaining with customers, and ensuring that her family could survive. Women in these roles were often the primary breadwinners, especially in the poorer neighborhoods of the empire, where they would work alongside men in trade, crafting, and farming. These women, while still restricted by societal norms, often enjoyed more freedom of movement and could participate in the economic life of the empire more directly than their elite counterparts. For women in rural areas, life was defined by a more traditional set of responsibilities. These women spent their days working in the fields, tending to animals, and managing the household. Imagine the endless hours of labor, the heat of the sun beating down on you as you gather crops or care for livestock. Life in rural Ottoman society was often harsh, and women were expected to contribute to the family's survival through hard physical labor. Yet these women, despite their physical labor, were still bound by the expectations of modesty and family honor that governed the lives of all women in the empire. While the Ottoman Empire was largely patriarchal, women did have legal rights, particularly within the family. They had the right to own property, inherit land, and engage in business transactions. Imagine yourself as a woman in the Ottoman legal system, where you have the ability to manage your own wealth, make decisions about your property, and even initiate a divorce if necessary. However, while women had these legal rights, their ability to exercise them was often limited by the social constraints placed on them. Women's access to justice and property rights could be influenced by their class and social status, and the legal system often favored male authority in matters of inheritance and family law. In the religious sphere, women played important roles within the household, where they were responsible for maintaining religious practices and traditions. In the private space of the home, women ensured that prayers were offered, fasts were kept, and the family adhered to the religious and social norms that governed Ottoman society. Picture yourself as a woman in the home, teaching your children about the Quran, preparing meals for the family during Ramadan, and ensuring that the home remains a place of piety and devotion. Despite the many restrictions, there were instances where Ottoman women managed to transcend their roles, carving out spaces of influence and power. Women like Hurrem Sultan, the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, are examples of how a woman's position in Ottoman society could evolve from one of seclusion to one of extraordinary influence. Hurrem, originally a slave in the harem, rose to become the Sultan's favorite, and later, his wife. Her influence in the palace and her ability to maneuver within the political landscape allowed her to shape the destiny of the empire in ways few women in history ever had the chance to do. As you reflect on the role of women in the Ottoman Empire, you are reminded of the complexities of their lives. For many women, the empire was a world of both opportunity and constraint, where power and influence could be gained, but only within the limits imposed by societal norms. Their lives were shaped by the needs of the empire, by the role of religion, and by the expectations placed on them as women. Yet, despite these limitations, Ottoman women played crucial roles in the empire's cultural, social, and political life. As we move forward through the Ottoman Empire's intricate society, we now focus on the heart of its economy, the peasantry. The farmers, laborers, and rural workers who lived on the fringes of the empire's grand cities were the backbone of the Ottoman Empire's wealth and sustenance. Yet, for most of these individuals, life was a constant struggle. Their world was shaped by the cycles of seasons, the demands of land, and the unyielding pressure of survival. Though often unseen, their work and their lives were essential to maintaining the empire's vast and sprawling structure. Imagine yourself living in one of the countless small villages scattered across the Ottoman countryside. The days begin early, as the sun rises over fields of grain, vineyards, or orchards. The smell of fresh earth fills the air, mingling with the faint scent of dew that clings to the plants. You are a peasant, tasked with working the land, planting crops, tending to livestock, and performing all the necessary tasks to sustain not only your family but also the empire. Life in the rural areas of the empire was simple, but it was also brutally hard. Every day brought new challenges, unpredictable weather, fluctuating harvests, and the pressure to meet the demands of both local and imperial authorities. As a peasant, your life revolves around the land. You rise before dawn to tend to the fields or the animals, spending long hours in the hot sun or the cold, depending on the season. The cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting defines your existence. Imagine the long hours spent hunched over in the field, your hands rough from handling tools, your back aching from the repetitive motions of planting and harvesting. You work in the company of your fellow villagers, each of you contributing to the collective effort that sustains the community. But life as a peasant was never guaranteed to be easy or fruitful. The weather was a constant worry. Too much rain could flood your crops, while too little could result in drought and poor harvests. The cycles of nature were beyond your control, and the consequences of a bad harvest were dire. The fragile balance of life depended on factors outside your hands. Imagine the anxiety that might grip you as you look at the sky, hoping for rain, fearing the impending dry season. The crops that grow in your fields are not just your livelihood, they are a means of survival for your family and for the empire itself. Peasants were not only dependent on their own labor but also on the demands of the state. The Ottoman Empire relied heavily on agricultural production to fuel its economy. The immerse system, a form of land grant, was a key component of the empire's military and economic structure. Land was often granted to military officers or bureaucrats, who in turn expected peasants to work the land and produce taxes for the state. Imagine yourself, a peasant, living under the authority of a sipahi, a landholder who claims a portion of your crops in exchange for the right to live and work on the land. You are obligated to pay a portion of your harvest in taxes, a demand that sometimes feels unreasonably high. Your labor is taken for granted, and the weight of the taxes often leaves little room for you to save or prepare for difficult times. The Ottoman peasants had little autonomy over the land they worked. The immerse system meant that even though they worked on the land, they had no ownership of it. The sipahi had the right to demand labor, taxes, and even soldiers from the peasants. Your life, as a peasant, is bound to the land and to the whims of those who control it. The sipahi often acted as intermediaries between the state and the peasantry, but their role was fraught with corruption, and many peasants lived under harsh conditions as a result. The sipahi could impose excessive taxes, demand unpaid labor, and at times, make life intolerable for the peasants who lived under their control. In addition to the burdens imposed by the state and landholders, peasants also faced the constant threat of conflict. The Ottoman Empire, though powerful, was also vulnerable to internal strife, invasions, and uprisings. Imagine the anxiety of a peasant living near the empire's borders, where raids or military campaigns could disrupt the fragile stability of village life. Even within the empire's heart, peasants faced the threat of revolts, where impoverished or discontented villagers rose up against the system that kept them in servitude. These uprisings were often brutally suppressed, and their consequences for the peasants were severe. Punishments ranged from execution to forced relocation. Life for the peasant was also marked by a deep sense of isolation. Though some villages had schools and places of worship, most peasants had little access to education or cultural life. Their world was small, confined to the cycles of the seasons and the rhythms of their labor. Even within the empire's vast capital, Constantinople, peasants would have felt like strangers, their lives so different from those of the wealthy merchants or the ruling elite. The divide between the elite and the peasantry was immense, and the lack of mobility meant that many peasants could only dream of a better life. Yet, despite the hardship, the Ottoman peasantry exhibited remarkable resilience. Villages were often tight-knit communities, where neighbors relied on each other for support, and local customs and traditions created bonds that transcended the difficulties of daily life. Festivals and religious observances provided brief respites from the burdens of labor, offering opportunities for social interaction, music, and feasting. Imagine the simple joy of gathering with others in your village to celebrate a religious holiday, singing songs and sharing meals. These moments of community were vital to sustaining the peasant's spirit, giving meaning to their work and offering a temporary escape from the endless cycle of labor. The peasantry, though often invisible in the grand history of the Ottoman Empire, was a crucial part of its success and its downfall. The empire's power depended on the agricultural output of its rural population, but the relentless demands placed on the peasants took a toll on their quality of life. The peasantry's struggles reflect the contradictions at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a vast, powerful empire whose success was built on the backs of those who lived in its shadows. As you reflect on the lives of these peasants, you are reminded of their vital role in shaping the history of the empire. Their labor, their resilience, and their sacrifices kept the empire functioning for centuries, even as they themselves lived in constant struggle. They were the unseen workers, the silent contributors to the empire's wealth and power. As we move away from the hard, demanding lives of the peasantry, we now turn to a more colorful aspect of Ottoman life, the customs and festivals that punctuated the empire's calendar. While these celebrations often marked joyous occasions, they were also shaped by the complex dynamics of the empire, reflecting the deep divisions between social classes, the role of religion, and the state's control over its citizens. Festivals in the Ottoman Empire were opportunities for unity, but they also served as reminders of the power structures that defined everyday life. Imagine yourself in the heart of Constantinople during one of the grand festivals that marked the Ottoman calendar. The air is filled with excitement as the city prepares for a celebration, perhaps the Sikir Bayrami, sugar feast, which marks the end of Ramadan, or the Kurban Bayrami, feast of sacrifice, which commemorates the willingness of Ibrahim to sacrifice his son as an act of obedience to God. The streets of the city come alive with color, as merchants set up stalls selling sweets, fragrant meats, and flowers. People from all walks of life gather in the public spaces, greeting each other with smiles and laughter. The sound of music fills the air, and the aroma of roasting lamb and freshly baked pastries wafts through the streets. In this scene, imagine the vibrancy of the festivities, the laughter of children, the exchange of gifts, the joy of families coming together to mark an important religious occasion. The city feels alive with energy, as people from all backgrounds participate in the celebrations. For the elite, this is a moment to indulge in luxury, to host lavish feasts, to attend opulent balls, and to display their wealth and status. But even for the poor, there is a moment of respite. In the villages and neighborhoods, the humble can join in the spirit of celebration, enjoying the simple pleasures of food, music, and community. Yet, beneath the surface of these festivities lies a deeper truth. These celebrations, while joyous, were also shaped by the political and social realities of the empire. The Ottoman Empire, like many empires, used festivals to reinforce its control over the population. The grand events were often orchestrated by the Sultan and his court, and the celebrations provided an opportunity for the state to demonstrate its power and dominance. Imagine the presence of the elite officials and dignitaries who walk among the crowds, their eyes scanning for signs of dissent, their influence felt in every corner of the celebration. The Sultan himself, often at the center of these events, symbolized the unity of the empire, and his presence lent an air of solemnity to the festivities. The people, too, were reminded of the Sultan's authority during these events. Kurban Bayrami, for example, was a time when sacrifices were made, an offering to God, but also a demonstration of obedience to the imperial system. The act of slaughtering animals for the feast was a public display of both religious devotion and loyalty to the empire. The Sultan's officials would often ensure that the sacrifices were performed according to the strict rituals set forth by the state. These public acts of sacrifice reinforced the power of the Sultan and the role of religion in legitimizing his rule. For the common people, participating in these rituals was both a spiritual act and a reminder of their place in the empire's hierarchy. Beyond the religious festivals, the Ottomans also celebrated a number of secular events that reflected the empire's cultural diversity. These festivals, while more localized, were just as vibrant and meaningful. Imagine the festivities surrounding the Hidrolez, the celebration of spring, where the people of Constantinople and beyond come together to mark the arrival of warmer weather. The air is filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the sounds of music and dancing echo through the streets. This was a time for joy, but also a time when the role of tradition and cultural identity became apparent. For the people of various ethnic backgrounds, this was an opportunity to express their customs, to gather with family and friends, and to reflect on the year gone by. Yet, these customs were not always free from tension. While festivals brought people together, they also revealed the deep divisions within Ottoman society. The elite, with their lavish celebrations, lived lives that were worlds apart from the poor and working classes, whose participation in the festivals was often marked by hardship. For many, the festivals provided a brief escape from the struggles of everyday life, but they also highlighted the disparities in wealth, power, and privilege. Imagine the contrasts between the grand feasts held by the Sultan's court and the humble gatherings in the poorer quarters of the city. The poor may enjoy the food and music, but their lives remain defined by labor and scarcity. Festivals in the Ottoman Empire were also shaped by the empire's religious and political changes. As the empire expanded, new customs and practices were introduced into the mix, creating a dynamic cultural environment. The influx of new peoples, ideas, and traditions resulted in a rich tapestry of festivities that spanned from one end of the empire to the other. Yet, these celebrations were not without their challenges. With the rise of nationalism and increasing tensions within the empire, some festivals were reinterpreted, redefined, or even suppressed. The state often controlled the narrative of these celebrations, ensuring that they served to reinforce the unity of the empire and its rulers. Despite the control exerted by the state, these festivals were also moments of personal expression. They were times when people from all walks of life, peasants, artisans, merchants, and aristocrats, could come together to celebrate their shared identity, albeit within the confines of the larger Ottoman system. The festivals served as both a unifying force and a reminder of the complexities of Ottoman rule. While the celebrations may have been joyous, they were never completely free from the shadow of power, authority, and the unequal social system that underpinned Ottoman society. As you reflect on these customs and festivals, you realize that they were not just moments of escape from the burdens of daily life. They were, in many ways, microcosms of the empire itself. The joy, the music, the food, the dancing, all of it was woven into the fabric of Ottoman society. But beneath the surface of these celebrations lay the deeper truths of power, class, and control that defined the empire's structure. As we continue our exploration of the Ottoman Empire, we now turn to one of its most defining features, its military might. The Ottomans were an empire forged in the crucible of warfare, their vast empire expanded and maintained through centuries of conquest, skirmishes, and bloody battles. But behind the glinting armor and the roar of victorious soldiers lies the true cost of empire building, an endless cycle of war that shaped the lives of the empire's citizens and soldiers alike. Warfare, while a means of empire building, came at a tremendous price, leaving its marks not only on the battlefield but on the people who lived through it. Imagine yourself on the outskirts of a great battlefield, the ground beneath your feet scarred by the passage of soldiers, the air thick with the sounds of clashing swords and shouting commands. The Ottomans, with their formidable military machine, have always been on the move, expanding the empire's borders, defending against threats, and asserting their dominance in the world. From the distant deserts of North Africa to the snow-covered fields of Eastern Europe, the Ottoman forces were everywhere, constantly engaged in war. The sound of the Ottoman army marching in unison was one that reverberated through the hearts of their enemies and allies alike. The life of an Ottoman soldier was one of constant readiness, brutal discipline, and long campaigns. Imagine yourself as a young recruit in the Ottoman army, conscripted into the service of the Sultan. Your days are filled with grueling training, learning the ways of combat, how to wield a sword, how to fight in formation, how to march for miles without rest. The discipline is intense, your every action monitored and critiqued by your commanders. There is no room for weakness, and your success as a soldier depends on your ability to endure the hardships of military life. The training is not just physical but mental. As a soldier in the Ottoman army, you are taught to see yourself as part of a greater whole, a cog in the vast military machine that is the Ottoman Empire. Every soldier knows that their duty is not just to themselves but to the empire, to its glory, its expansion, and its defense. The army is a source of pride, but it is also a source of suffering. The long marches, the harsh weather, the constant danger of battle, all of this is a soldier's reality. Now, imagine yourself in the heat of battle, your armor heavy, your sword raised high, your heart pounding in your chest. The enemy is ahead, their ranks swelling, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. The battlefield is chaotic, soldiers charging forward, the clash of steel ringing in the air, the shouts of men as they fight for survival. In the Ottoman army, the soldiers fought not just for victory, but for survival. Each battle was a test of endurance, of strategy, and of resolve. The Ottomans were known for their innovative tactics, often relying on surprise, speed, and mobility to overwhelm their enemies. Picture the famous Ottoman Janissaries, elite infantry soldiers who formed the backbone of the army. These warriors were trained to be swift, disciplined, and deadly, moving with precision on the battlefield. They wielded powerful bows and swords, and their training was intense, designed to create soldiers who were not just fighters, but also tacticians. Imagine the Janissaries charging into battle, their formation tight, their movements coordinated. The enemy might be larger in number, but the Janissaries' discipline and skill make them a formidable force. But even the greatest victories came with a heavy toll. Warfare in the Ottoman Empire was not just about fighting. It was about managing the empire's vast territories and ensuring the stability of the state. The Ottomans fought wars of expansion, but they also fought wars of defense, constantly protecting their borders from external threats. Imagine the constant strain on the empire's resources, as soldiers were raised, trained, and sent off to battle. The costs of maintaining such a large military were immense, not only in terms of money but also in terms of the human cost. The soldiers who fought in these wars often came from poor or rural backgrounds, and their families felt the consequences of their service. After a long and bloody battle, the aftermath would often be just as brutal. The Ottomans, like many empires, relied on the spoils of war to fund their military campaigns. The defeated enemies were not only left to lick their wounds, but often became the subjects of plunder and tribute. The Ottomans were notorious for their conquest of cities and territories, and once a city was taken, its inhabitants often found themselves subjected to the whims of the conquerors. Imagine the fear that would grip the population as the Ottoman forces approached. Would they be enslaved, forced to pay tribute, or suffer the consequences of rebellion? For the common people who lived in the wake of Ottoman conquest, the fear of war was constant. Entire villages were uprooted, families torn apart, and lives disrupted. The empire's conquest might bring glory to the Sultan, but it brought suffering to the conquered. The violence of war was not just something that occurred on the battlefield. It reached into the homes and lives of the civilians who lived in its path. For the empire itself, the cost of endless warfare began to show. The Ottoman military, once unstoppable, began to feel the strain of its own expansion. The soldiers who fought in distant lands became weary, their morale weakened by the constant demands of war. The empire's resources were stretched thin, and the once mighty army found itself ill-prepared for the new challenges it faced. As the empire's territories grew, it became harder to manage and defend them. The costs of maintaining such a vast military presence became unsustainable, and the Ottoman army, once a symbol of power, slowly began to decline. As you reflect on the cost of Ottoman warfare, you realize that empire building was never just a matter of conquest. It was a continuous cycle of battle, expansion, and defense, a cycle that drained the empire's resources and left deep scars on both its soldiers and its civilians. The Ottoman Empire, though victorious in many of its wars, ultimately paid a heavy price for its military success. The empire's strength, built on the backs of soldiers who fought for its glory, was undermined by the very system that had allowed it to grow. The wars fought by the Ottomans, from their early campaigns of conquest to their later struggles to defend their borders, were a testament to the strength of the empire. But they were also a reminder of the toll that warfare took on those who fought, and on the empire itself. The cost of empire building was high, and though the Ottomans' victories may have been celebrated, the price they paid was never fully accounted for. As we reflect on the vastness and power of the Ottoman Empire, we now turn our attention to its eventual decline, a gradual and painful erosion of the empire's once mighty strength. The Ottoman Empire, which had flourished for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of internal struggles, external pressures, and the changing dynamics of the world. The decline was not sudden. It was a slow process, marked by political instability, military defeats, economic challenges, and social unrest. But despite its length, the decline of the Ottoman Empire was as inevitable as the passing of time itself. Imagine yourself living in the late 17th century, at the height of the empire's territorial expanse. The empire is vast, stretching from the shores of North Africa to the gates of Vienna, from the Arabian Peninsula to the heart of the Balkans. The Sultan is still a powerful figure, the military still a force to be reckoned with, and the empire's cities are centers of commerce, culture, and learning. Yet, beneath the surface, cracks are beginning to appear. The military, once the empire's greatest strength, has started to falter. The Janissaries, once the elite force of the Ottoman army, have become entrenched in politics and self-interest, and their discipline has waned. The empire's military campaigns, once swift and decisive, now face increasing resistance from powerful European nations, and the Ottomans find themselves engaged in costly wars they can no longer afford. Imagine the frustration of Ottoman commanders, who struggled to keep their armies unified and effective as external pressures from Russia, Austria, and other European powers intensify. The battles are longer, the casualties higher, and the victories fewer. As the empire's military power declines, so does its political authority. The sultans, once strong and decisive leaders, are increasingly sidelined by corruption, palace intrigue, and ineffective leadership. Imagine yourself as a member of the imperial court, where factions vie for influence, where political power is no longer determined by competence or ability, but by favoritism and betrayal. The system that once unified the empire now divides it. The sultans, often more focused on their personal affairs and the opulence of their palaces, lose sight of the empire's growing challenges. Meanwhile, the empire's bureaucratic machinery, once the envy of the world, grows inefficient and riddled with corruption. In the provinces, the empire's vast territories are increasingly difficult to control. The Timur system, which once provided land and resources to the military elite in exchange for loyalty and service, begins to break down. Local leaders, once loyal to the Sultan, begin to assert their own power, and regions of the empire become semi-autonomous, further weakening the central government. Imagine the sense of disintegration as the authority of the Sultan begins to fade in the eyes of his subjects, who are more loyal to their local leaders than to the distant palace. The once unified Ottoman territories now become a patchwork of competing interests and divided allegiances. Meanwhile, the empire's economy, once fueled by the flow of goods from the east to the west, begins to stagnate. European powers, like Britain, France, and the Netherlands, begin to dominate global trade, bypassing Ottoman-controlled routes and leaving the empire struggling to maintain its economic relevance. The Ottomans are slow to adapt to the rise of capitalism, the growth of industrial economies, and the emergence of global trade networks. Imagine yourself as a merchant in Istanbul, once at the heart of a thriving trade network, now struggling to keep your business afloat as European goods flood the market and the empire's economic policies remain outdated. As the empire's power wanes, so too does its cultural influence. The Ottomans, who once blended the best of Eastern and Western traditions, now find themselves overshadowed by the intellectual, cultural, and technological advancements of Europe. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the scientific revolution have transformed the West, while the Ottomans remain largely isolated from these developments. Imagine the sense of intellectual stagnation, as the Ottoman Empire, once a beacon of knowledge and culture, now lags behind its European counterparts. The empire's ability to innovate and adapt seems to falter, and with it, its cultural and intellectual leadership. The decline of the Ottoman Empire is also marked by the rise of nationalist movements within its borders. The once cohesive empire, home to a myriad of ethnic and religious groups, now faces the growing demands for independence and autonomy from its diverse populations. The Arabs, the Greeks, the Armenians, and the Kurds all begin to assert their own identities and challenge the Ottoman rule. Imagine the tension building as local populations demand more freedom, more rights, and the ability to govern themselves. The Ottoman rulers, already weakened by internal divisions and external pressures, struggle to contain these growing movements. The empire's once unified identity fractures, and nationalist uprisings become more frequent, further eroding the empire's stability. By the 19th century, the empire has become the sick man of Europe, a term coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia to describe the empire's weakening state. The empire's territorial losses mount, as it is forced to cede land to European powers and rebellious provinces. The Ottomans lose control of Greece, Serbia, Egypt, and much of North Africa. Imagine the sorrow that grips the empire as it watches its territories slip away one by one, its borders shrinking, its power waning. The loss of these territories is not just a military setback, it is a blow to the Ottoman identity, a symbol of the empire's diminishing influence on the world stage. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire is no longer the powerful force it once was. The empire is burdened by debt, weakened by corruption, and fragmented by internal divisions. The Ottoman sultans, once the most powerful rulers in the world, are now mere figureheads, their authority limited to the walls of their palace. In 1922, the Ottoman Empire officially comes to an end, replaced by the modern Turkish Republic under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. As you reflect on the decline of the Ottoman Empire, you realize that it was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of its power, authority, and influence. The empire, once the greatest in the world, was undone by internal decay, external pressures, and the changing currents of history. The slow collapse of the Ottoman Empire is a reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest empires. Time and again, history shows that empires rise and fall, their legacies shaped by the people, the decisions, and the circumstances that define them. As we move away from the grandeur of imperial conquests and the slow erosion of the empire's power, we now turn to one of the more comforting and sustaining aspects of Ottoman life, its cuisine. Food, in many ways, tells the story of a people, their culture, and their way of life. In the Ottoman Empire, the food was as diverse as the lands it spanned, rich, simple, and designed to sustain the hardworking people of the empire, from the nobility to the peasants. The flavors of the empire were influenced by the diverse peoples who lived within it. Turkish, Arab, Persian, and Balkan culinary traditions blended together to create a cuisine that was both varied and deeply ingrained in the daily rhythm of life. Imagine yourself in the kitchens of a grand Ottoman palace, where the scent of spices fills the air. Cumin, coriander, saffron, and cinnamon mingle with the rich aroma of roasting meats. The chefs, skilled in the art of Ottoman cooking, prepare dishes fit for sultans, their hands moving with practiced ease as they craft meals that are both beautiful and rich in flavor. The food served in the palace is a reflection of the empire's wealth, elegant, opulent, and varied, but also deeply rooted in tradition. However, for most people in the empire, food was simpler, more humble, but no less important. Imagine yourself in a small Ottoman village, where you wake at dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. The day begins with a simple breakfast of simit, a sesame-covered bread, often paired with olives, cheese, and a cup of tea. The food is nourishing, meant to sustain you through the long hours of work in the fields or at the market. The bread, soft and warm, is the foundation of nearly every meal, and the familiar taste of olives and cheese offers comfort and sustenance. In the bustling streets of Constantinople, food vendors call out to passers-by, offering kebab, stuffed flatbreads, and pilaf. The markets, alive with the colors of fresh produce, dried fruits, and fragrant spices, are where the city's diverse culinary traditions come to life. Imagine yourself walking through these vibrant streets, stopping at a stall where the sizzling sound of kebabs cooking on an open flame fills the air. The tender meat, seasoned with a blend of spices, is served with warm bread and a side of yogurt, a simple yet satisfying meal that carries the flavors of centuries-old culinary traditions. Ottoman cuisine, though varied, is centered around a few key staples that sustained the empire's people across its vast territories. Grains, especially wheat, rice, and bulgur, formed the foundation of many meals. Pilaf, a dish of rice cooked with spices, vegetables, and often meat, was a staple food for people of all social classes. Imagine the comforting aroma of pilaf, cooking over a low flame, as you prepare it for dinner. The rice absorbs the flavors of the spices, and the dish is simple yet full of depth. For the peasants and workers in the empire, pilaf was a quick and nourishing meal that could be eaten alone or served alongside stews and vegetables. Vegetables also played a vital role in Ottoman cuisine, with dishes like imam bayildi, a stuffed eggplant dish cooked in olive oil, showcasing the use of seasonal ingredients in creative and delicious ways. The use of zeytinyagli, olive oil-based dishes, was common in the empire's cuisine, reflecting the abundant olive groves that stretched across the Mediterranean coast. Imagine yourself enjoying a meal of roasted vegetables and tender lamb, all drizzled with rich, golden olive oil, simple ingredients, prepared with care, and full of flavor. For the elite, feasts were an opportunity to showcase both the wealth and culinary sophistication of the empire. The banquets held in the Sultan's court featured an array of lavish dishes, each more elaborate than the last. Imagine the tables laden with roasted lamb, stuffed vegetables, dolma, grape leaves stuffed with rice and meat, and baklava, a sweet pastry layered with nuts and soaked in syrup. The lavish meals were not only about the food but about the spectacle. The presentation of each dish was an art form, meant to impress and delight the guests. These banquets were a reflection of the power and glory of the Ottoman sultans, and the food served in the palace was as much a symbol of imperial dominance as it was a source of nourishment. Desserts, too, were an essential part of Ottoman cuisine, and the sweets enjoyed by the nobility were often rich and intricate, made with sugar, honey, and nuts. Baklava, with its flaky pastry and sweet syrup, is perhaps the most famous of these desserts, but there were many others. Kunefe, a pastry made with shredded dough and cheese, lokum, Turkish delight, and atayef, stuffed pancakes drizzled with syrup. Imagine sitting in a palace courtyard, sipping on Turkish coffee, and enjoying a small piece of baklava, the sweet, flaky layers melting in your mouth as the strong, bitter coffee contrasts with the dessert's sweetness. Yet, despite the opulence of the Sultan's banquets, the simplicity of peasant meals is what truly sustained the empire. The Ottoman people, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest noble, relied on a shared culinary tradition that centered around the availability of local, seasonal ingredients. Kebabs and mees, small appetizers, might be enjoyed in a local cafe or on a family's terrace, where friends and relatives gathered to share food and conversation. Meals were not just about sustenance. They were about community, about sharing a moment of joy, and about connecting with others. Imagine sitting down with your family or neighbors, passing around dishes of olives, cheese, and fresh bread, and enjoying the simple pleasures of a shared meal. In the homes of the empire's rural population, food was also a means of survival. The peasants, working the land, relied on the crops they grew for their daily meals. Wheat and barley were used for making bread, which was eaten at every meal. The vegetables, carrots, beans, lentils, and cucumbers, were the staples of the Ottoman peasants' diet. The fruits, apples, pomegranates, and figs, were enjoyed when in season, providing a burst of sweetness after a long day of labor. Imagine the satisfaction of enjoying a fresh piece of fruit after working in the fields, its sweetness a rare luxury in a life dominated by hard work and uncertainty. Ottoman cuisine was a reflection of the empire itself, diverse, rich in tradition, and deeply tied to the land. It provided sustenance for the empire's vast population, from the ruling elite to the common folk, and it was a way of life that transcended class and region. Though the empire may have faced challenges and conflicts, the food, simple or extravagant, offered comfort and connection for the people of the empire. As we continue our journey through the Ottoman Empire, we now turn our attention to the distant provinces, the regions far from the grandeur of the imperial capital, Constantinople. These territories, often remote and isolated, were the backbone of the empire, providing food, resources, and soldiers to sustain the Ottoman state. Yet, for those living in the provinces, life was marked by hardship, isolation, and the constant struggle to survive under the weight of imperial demands. Imagine yourself living in one of these rural provinces, far from the glittering palaces and bustling markets of the empire's heart. Your village, nestled in the rolling hills of Anatolia or the dusty plains of North Africa, is small and quiet. The sounds of nature dominate your days. The chirping of birds, the rustling of trees in the wind, the bleating of sheep, and the occasional creak of a cart as it makes its way down a dirt road. The air is thick with the scent of earth, with smoke, and the ever-present aroma of olive oil. Your life is one of hard work. You are a farmer, a craftsman, or a laborer. Your role is simple, but vital to the empire's survival. You wake at dawn, as the first light begins to touch the horizon, and begin your daily tasks. If you are a farmer, you tend to the crops, plowing the fields with the help of animals or hand tools. The crops are your livelihood, and you depend on them for food, for income, and for survival. Wheat, barley, and olives are your staples, but you also grow vegetables and fruits when the seasons allow. Imagine the exhausting work of planting and harvesting by hand, with the sun beating down on your back as you bend over the fields. The rhythm of your day is dictated by the seasons, planting in the spring, working through the summer heat, and harvesting in the fall. Yet, despite the toil, your life is always precarious. The land is your provider, but it can also be your enemy. The weather, unpredictable and unforgiving, can make or break your year. A harsh winter can kill your crops, a dry summer can scorch your fields, and a sudden storm can flood the land. Your food is never guaranteed, and hunger is always a threat. Imagine the anxiety of seeing the skies darken with clouds, wondering if rain will come in time to save your crops, or if the drought will continue, leaving you with nothing but barren land. The demands of the Ottoman state are another burden on your shoulders. You are expected to pay taxes to the central government, a portion of your crops or your earnings taken in exchange for the protection the empire provides. The taxes, levied by local authorities or the Sipahi, landholders, are often heavy, and you have little power to negotiate them. Imagine yourself at the mercy of these authorities, who may demand more than you can afford, leaving you struggling to feed your family. The immerse system, which granted land to military officers and local elites in exchange for their service, often left peasants like you with little autonomy or protection. The land you work on might be controlled by a local Sipahi, and while you farm it, the profits go to him, leaving you with only a fraction of what you produce. In addition to the taxes, you must also contribute to the empire's military needs. As a male in the provinces, you might be conscripted into military service, called upon to defend the empire or to join in one of its numerous military campaigns. The devshirme system, though it primarily affected Christian boys, could also have ripple effects on the Muslim population, as many men from the provinces were recruited into the army. Imagine the anxiety and fear that comes with this potential conscription, as you wonder if you will be taken from your family, forced to fight in a war far from home. Life in the provinces is also marked by a sense of isolation. The grandeur of Constantinople seems distant, and the power of the Sultan feels like an abstraction. You rarely see the emperor, and your contact with the central government is limited to the demands of taxes and military service. Local rulers, often Sipahi or other appointed officials, are the ones who enforce the will of the empire in your daily life. These officials, while sometimes just, are often corrupt, taking advantage of their power to enrich themselves at the expense of the peasants. The sense of being forgotten by the empire, of living at the edge of the world, is palpable. Your life is governed by the cycles of nature and the demands of distant rulers, with little control over your own destiny. However, despite the hardships, there is a sense of resilience in the provinces. The people here are strong, having learned to survive in difficult circumstances. The tight-knit communities of the rural provinces provide a sense of security, as neighbors help each other with farming, building homes, and sharing food. The village festivals, small but significant, offer moments of respite from the struggles of daily life. Imagine the joy of gathering with your family and friends to celebrate a harvest, a religious holiday, or simply the changing of the seasons. These moments, though fleeting, are vital to maintaining a sense of hope and connection to the land and to each other. but the life of a peasant in the provinces is also marked by a lack of opportunity. While the elites in the cities enjoy a life of luxury, those in the provinces have little hope of upward mobility. Education is scarce, and the rigid social structure of the empire makes it difficult for people to break out of their predetermined roles. The empire's wealth, power, and cultural achievements seem distant and unattainable. For many in the provinces, their lives are defined by the struggle to survive, farming the land, paying taxes, and living within the limits set by the empire's rulers. As you reflect on life in the Ottoman provinces, you realize that it was a life marked by simplicity, hardship, and resilience. The provinces, though far from the grandeur of the empire's capital, were the lifeblood of the empire, providing the food, soldiers, and resources that sustained the Sultan's rule. Yet, for those living in the provinces, life was a constant struggle, defined by their relationship to the land, the oppressive demands of the state, and the isolation that came from living on the fringes of the empire. As we near the end of our journey through the history of the Ottoman Empire, we now reflect on its enduring legacy, a legacy shaped by both triumphs and struggles, by moments of extraordinary power and wealth, as well as periods of slow, inevitable decline. Though the empire officially came to an end in 1922, its influence continues to reverberate through the modern world, seen in the art, culture, politics, and borders of the nations that once lay under Ottoman rule. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of modern-day Istanbul, a city that once served as the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire. The magnificent mosques with their soaring minarets still dominate the skyline, their majestic domes offering a silent tribute to the empire's architectural and religious legacy. The bustling markets, which once hummed with the activity of Ottoman traders, now offer a blend of the old and the new. The scent of fresh spices, sweet baklava, and roasted lamb fills the air, evoking memories of a time when the Ottomans ruled over a vast empire. But the city, much like the empire itself, is a complex tapestry of old and new, of tradition and modernity. The Ottomans left their mark on the city, shaping its culture, its architecture, and its identity. But Istanbul is also a city in transition, much like the empire itself was in its final years. The influence of the Ottoman Empire extends far beyond Istanbul. In the Balkans, North Africa, and the Middle East, the remnants of Ottoman rule are still visible. In cities like Sarajevo, Cairo, and Damascus, Ottoman architecture, culture, and traditions continue to shape daily life. The legal and administrative systems, many of which were based on Islamic principles and Ottoman law, have had a lasting impact on the region's governance and social structure. The Ottomans brought with them the millet system, which allowed for religious autonomy among different communities. This system has left its mark on the way many countries in the former Ottoman territories manage religious and ethnic diversity. Yet, despite its vast influence, the Ottoman Empire was not immune to the pressures of time. The decline of the empire, with its slow erosion of power and influence, is a reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest empires. The Ottomans, once the masters of a vast, multi-ethnic realm, struggled to adapt to the changing political and economic landscape of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The rise of nationalism, the growth of European imperial powers, and the onset of industrialization left the Ottomans struggling to keep pace. In many ways, the empire's inability to adapt to the rapidly changing world led to its eventual collapse. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a painful and tumultuous process. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, marked the empire's disintegration, and the Turkish Republic, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, replaced the Ottoman monarchy. The empire's territories were divided, and new national boundaries were drawn, often without regard for the ethnic and religious groups that had lived together for centuries. The legacy of this division can still be seen in the political struggles, territorial disputes, and ethnic tensions that persist in the region today. The Ottoman Empire's collapse also led to the formation of new nation-states, many of which carry forward the cultural and historical influences of the empire, even as they assert their own identities. But the Ottoman Empire's legacy is not solely one of division and decline. It is also a legacy of cultural flourishing, intellectual achievement, and social complexity. The Ottomans were patrons of the arts, commissioning magnificent works of architecture, calligraphy, and literature. Their court culture, with its elaborate rituals, music, and poetry, continues to influence the arts in the modern Middle East and beyond. Ottoman cuisine, which we explored earlier, continues to be a cornerstone of the culinary traditions of the region, enjoyed by people across the globe. The empire's contributions to art, science, and philosophy helped bridge the gap between the Islamic world and Europe, preserving and transmitting knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The Ottoman legacy is also seen in the modern political landscape. Many of the borders drawn after the empire's collapse still define the nations of the Middle East and Southeast Europe today. Countries like Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon are all shaped, to some degree, by their Ottoman past. The empire's role in shaping modern governance, from its legal systems to its diplomatic traditions, continues to influence the political systems in these regions. The legacy of the Devshirme system, which shaped the formation of elite military and administrative classes, can also be seen in the way modern bureaucracies in these countries operate. In many ways, the legacy of the Ottoman Empire is one of resilience. The empire may have fallen, but the cultures, traditions, and identities it nurtured have endured. The people who lived under Ottoman rule, despite the hardships and the eventual decline of the empire, continue to shape the world today. The Ottoman Empire, though it no longer exists, has left an indelible mark on history, a mark that continues to be felt in the modern world. As you reflect on the legacy of the Ottoman Empire, you realize that it was an empire of contradictions. It was a realm of great wealth and grandeur, but also of poverty and hardship. It was a place of cultural flourishing, but also of deep social divides. The empire's decline was slow and painful, but its legacy endures in the cities, cultures, and people who were shaped by its rule. The Ottoman Empire may have fallen, but it is far from forgotten. Its legacy continues to influence the world today, and its story remains one of the most fascinating in the history of empires. And with that, we have completed our journey through the history of the Ottoman Empire, its rise, its triumphs, its struggles, and its eventual decline. The empire's impact on the world is undeniable, and its legacy continues to shape the modern world in ways both visible and unseen.